The body has two main communication systems. One is the nervous system, which works a lot like electrical wiring of the body. So it sends a signal through these wires, through these neurons, to a specific location where it acts on that location or that tissue, that organ. And it has to continually send those signals if it wants to continually act and affect that organ. The endocrine system works differently. It's a chemical-based system. Typically, we're talking about releasing chemical hormones into the blood, but it can be other fluids of the body as well. These signals are going to last a lot longer, and they're also going to create a sort of widespread effect. So it can affect lots of cells around the body all at the same time. We can see here a depiction that's fairly simple of the major endocrine glands. This is not all the endocrine glands. There's a lot more than this, but this is some of the big ones. The hormones that come from these endocrine glands, again, are chemical messengers. They are going to be used in order to maintain homeostasis in the body. This is both during rest and exercise. It regulates the cell and organ activities of various parts of the body. It acts on only target cells that have the hormone receptor for the hormone being released. So if it doesn't have the receptor, that cell is not going to be affected by that hormone. The hormones also must fit the receptor, so it's kind of like a lock and key situation. However, that lock, which is the receptor, does have the ability to be modified by other molecules that can bind to it. So it's not a simple lock and key situation, but it's a lock and key situation where the lock can change shapes and change activity by other molecules other than the hormone. As I've already mentioned, the endocrine system is acting to control homeostasis both during rest and during exercise, and it does so through controlling things like metabolism, regulating fluid and electrolyte balances within the body. It affects the blood pressure and the heart rate and other cardiovascular variables, and it controls protein synthesis, tissue growth, and maintenance and repair of tissues like skeletal muscle. As you can see, the endocrine system is really important for controlling the internal environment of the body, and we have different types of hormones that are at play with this. So I'm going to be going into that in another video. The endocrine system of the body has different types of hormones that it can release in order to affect the internal environment of the body. We have steroidal hormones, and we have non-steroidal hormones, and within the non-steroidal hormones, we have protein and peptide hormones, and we have amino acid hormones. The steroidal-based hormones are derived from cholesterols, which is a type of lipid, so think fat here. We're going to be talking about how that changes their function a little bit. The non-steroidal hormones, on the other side, are some form of amino acid or protein, so that also affects how it can get through the body and get into cells or affect cells. So for the steroidal hormones here, some example glands and some example hormones from those glands are the adrenal cortex, which releases cortisol and aldosterone, the ovaries, which release estrogen and progesterone, the testes, which release testosterone. So those are some important steroidal-based hormones. For the non-steroidal hormones, as I already mentioned, there's some sort of protein or peptide or amino acid, and those are going to come from lots of different glands as well. Some example glands and hormones from those glands are the pancreas, which releases glucagon and insulin, the pituitary gland, which releases growth hormone. All of these are forms of protein or peptide hormones. For the amino acid type hormones, which again is within the non-steroidal hormone umbrella. We have the thyroid gland, which releases thyroxine or T4 and triiodothyronine or T3. And we have the adrenal medulla gland, which releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we have lots of different types of hormones, different classifications of hormones, and these classifications do affect the function of the hormones. Looking at the steroidal hormones' functions, first, they are based on lipids, so they are not water soluble. Think about oil and water and how they don't mix. This does affect the ability of these hormones to get through the blood because the blood is mostly water. So they do require some sort of protein carrier, as we can see here by this gray structure suggesting a protein carrier. They need a protein carrier in order to get around the blood throughout the body. Once they get to the cell of that they're trying to act on, the protein carrier will be removed from the hormone. The hormone goes right through the cell membrane because it's based on lipids, and the cell membrane is a bilayer lipid membrane, so it is fat soluble, which is primarily what the membrane is made out of. And that hormone can go right in and bind with the cell receptor that's either in or near the nucleus. If it's near the nucleus, it typically goes inside the nucleus once it's bound in order to act on the DNA. So once it acts on the DNA, it's going to activate it to produce messenger RNA or mRNA, which comes out into the cytosol, interacts with the ribosomes to create new proteins. So this process is essentially going to create new machinery within the cell. Once we create this machinery can then act and do things that will cause the cell to work in a certain way. So this process oftentimes is longer and slower because we're creating new machinery, but it's going to be longer acting and it's going to have major impacts on the functions of that cell. The other major hormone type is the non-steroidal hormones, which includes those proteins, peptides, and amino acid-based hormones. These, because they are proteins, they are not lipid-based, they are water-soluble but not fat-soluble or not lipid-soluble. So these hormones can go right through the blood on their own without the need for a protein carrier like the steroidal hormones need. However, once they get to their cell that they're trying to affect, they cannot go through the membrane because the membrane is a bilayer lipid membrane and it's not fat soluble or it's lipid soluble. So the hormone must bind to a receptor on the outside of that cell. Once it binds to that receptor, it's going to activate a second messenger. There are lots of different types of second messengers, and these second messengers then go and carry out the function of that hormone within the cell. So they can interact with the DNA, affecting the proteins of the cell, but oftentimes will act within the cytosol of the cell without interacting directly with the nucleus in the DNA. So with this being said, if it's not acting on the nucleus, it's essentially not creating new machinery like the steroidal hormones are. It's going to increase or decrease the activity of the machinery that's already within the cell. So this can be a lot faster than creating new machinery like the steroidal hormones are trying to do, but it is a shorter acting type of hormone typically. Sometimes you'll hear about a third class of hormones called prostaglandins. They're not real hormones. They are pseudo hormones, meaning fake hormones, because they don't actually act the way other hormones do. Instead of being released into the bloodstream to float around the whole body to affect cells in distant locations, they are typically paracrine in action. We'll talk about that in a second. So prostaglandins are derived from arachidonic acid. An example of a prostaglandin is cyclooxygenase, and as an example of a real-world interaction that we have with cyclooxygenase is drugs like aspirin and ibuprofen that work to block the enzymes of cyclooxygenase. And the reason why they work to block those enzymes is typically, as I already mentioned, prostaglandins are paracrine that are released from one cell, typically acting on neighboring cells rather than floating through the bloodstream and affecting the body-wide. They are released by that cell when that cell is damaged or when there's some form of illness or infection going on, and they initiate the inflammatory response. So they initiate swelling, vasodilation, which helps with the swelling. They also sensitize nociceptors, which are the neurons that are responsible for sensing pain. All of this is often associated with injury. Hormone actions are impacted by the quantity of hormones as well as the number of receptors in the area. So I'm going to be covering that in another video. Hormones released by the endocrine system affects the whole body, and those hormones do need to be regulated in some way so that we don't have runaway systems that are negatively affecting how we function. So typically the hormones are released in bursts, so they're not released in slow quantities continuously. They're released in bursts and pulses, and those pulses come on, a lot of hormone enters the bloodstream, and then they stop, and they eventually dissipate over time. We typically regulate hormones with negative feedback loops, as I'm going to describe over here in a second. So essentially what I mean by negative feedback loop is having a low amount of the end product of that hormone stimulates the hormone's release to get more of the end product, and vice versa. Having a high amount of hormone end product is going to inhibit the release of more hormone, lowering the amount of hormone that gets into the bloodstream. Let's give an example of endocrine feedback loop, a negative feedback loop. If we look over here, we have hormone X listed. So this just means in generic, think of a hormone of your choice. I'm going to talk about glucagon. So glucagon's job is to raise blood sugar levels by releasing releasing glucose and increasing how much sugar is in the blood. So hormone X or glucagon, when it's in low concentrations in the body, that's going to lead to a low amount of the end product for that hormone, which is blood glucose for glucagon. When we have a low amount of blood glucose, that's going to feed back on the pancreas, which releases glucagon, to secrete more glucagon. When we have more glucagon released, that's going to increase the concentration of glucagon in the body, and specifically in the blood here, and that's going to lead to an increase of the end product of that, which is more blood glucose. Having more blood glucose is then going to feed back, negative feedback here, to decrease how much of glucagon is released by the pancreas, and eventually the glucagon gets used up and we end up with a low concentration of glucagon again, and the cycle continues. So this is a constant circular cycle causing oscillations in hormone levels. So hormone oscillations, which is what we see down here with this low hormone, high hormone, low hormone, high hormone here. Most hormones are going to oscillate in the matter of minutes to hours. Some hormones do oscillate in a longer period of time, days to weeks. This, regardless of how long it takes for it to oscillate, think of like a house thermostat. Where it's too cold, it ramps up. If it's too hot, it shuts off until the heat dissipates and it becomes cold again. And then when it gets cold, it ramps back up the heat. As I already mentioned, almost all the hormones in the body are going to use this negative feedback loop in order to control the hormone level. There are a handful of instances, think child labor and delivery, where we do have positive feedback loops where essentially you want a ramping up of hormones, which will continue to progress the labor process until the baby is born. But most processes of the body don't want a progressive increase in hormone level. We want a nice stable level of hormones that are around some sort of set point that give us the amount of the end product that we want. It's not just the amount of hormone, though, in our blood that is going to affect the amount of end product. It's also the number of receptors. I'm going to be talking about that in the next video. Besides just the amount of hormone being released into the blood, we also have another means of regulating the actions of the endocrine system and the hormones it releases. So if you were to look at just hormone concentration in the blood, it's oftentimes a poor indicator of the actual hormone activity. And the reason for this is the hormones have to bind to a receptor, and the number of receptors can change. So the number of receptors on a cell. Remember, not every cell has every receptor for every type of hormone. When there is a receptor on a cell, there's typically between 2,000 and 10,000 receptors for that hormone on that cell. So just to give you some numbers here. We can up and down regulate this. Downregulation is a decrease in the number of receptors, causing a desensitization of that cell to that type of hormone. Think whenever someone develops type 2 diabetes, when they become insulin resistant, the body is constantly flooding the bloodstream with insulin in order to put glucose inside the cells. And when that happens to an excessive degree, the body's cells start to pull back on its insulin receptors, which means you become insulin resistant. We are desensitizing or downregulating our insulin receptors in that situation. We can also upregulate our receptor number, which means increasing the receptors on a cell, causing an increased sensitization of that cell to the hormone we're talking about. In this case, it's oftentimes when there's a small amount of the hormone present and the cells need that hormone, they will increase the amount of hormone receptors that they have. This is going to increase the action of the hormone. So if we look over here at this diagram, there are 4 quadrants in this diagram, and we have different amounts of hormone activity present based on the situation of each quadrant. So we look at this upper left quadrant here, we have a low response, so a low hormone activity. That's because we have a low amount of circulating hormone. We also have only a handful of receptors for that hormone. So small circulating hormone, small number of receptors, you're definitely going to get a small hormone activity, a hormone response. If we increase the amount of hormone floating in the bloodstream, but we don't increase the number of receptors, we're going to get a more moderate response. This is because these hormone receptors are pretty much always going to be bound to hormone or have hormone bound to them. Soon as the hormone is broken down, another molecule of that hormone is ready to go and jump in that spot. So you're going to get a more moderate response when this happens. The opposite way we can get a moderate response is if we have a high amount of hormone receptor, but not a ton of the hormone floating around the bloodstream. So each receptor isn't always going to be bound to hormone, but the hormones floating around are going to be very easily able to find a receptor, so they are typically always going to be bound to a receptor. Again, you get a moderate response or moderate amount of hormone activity in this situation. In order to get a high amount of hormone activity, you want a lot of hormone floating around the bloodstream and a high number of receptors on the cells. This is going to mean you're going to get a maximum amount of hormone binding to receptors at any one point in time and a maximum amount of that hormone's activity. Again, this shows how it's not just the amount of hormone in the bloodstream, but also the number of receptors that are going to affect the hormone activity. So both of these are necessary in order to get high response. In either one of these, if they are low, it's going to cause a lower response. Remember, the job of the endocrine system is to maintain homeostasis of the internal environment of the body. It does this at rest, and it also does this during exercise. In another video, I'm going to be describing how continuous aerobic exercise is going to lead to a massive increase in a lot of different hormones in the body, and these hormones are going to then support the exercise session, allowing us to exercise at a high intensity or a moderate intensity even for a long duration period of time. Let's look at the effects on the endocrine system and on hormone concentrations within the blood of a bout of aerobic exercise. Specifically, we're looking at 3 hours of cycling at 65% of VO2 max. So it's a sort of moderate to vigorous bout of exercise here. We have time on the x-axis and percent change of the various hormones being shown here on the y-axis. We also are going to be discussing additional hormones that aren't on this graph in the tables on each side of the graph. When we start aerobic exercise, we're going to have a near immediate increase in several hormones. A couple of them are going to be the norepinephrine and epinephrine, which can be both released by the sympathetic neurons directly on cells of the body, and it can be released as an endocrine hormone by the adrenal gland. So these can be both hormones and neurotransmitters. We also have an immediate increase in glucagon. Remember, that's going to increase blood sugar. We have a decrease in insulin release from the pancreas, which is going to stop blood sugar from dropping and the blood glucose from going into the cells. We have an increase in cell sensitivity to insulin, which isn't a change in a hormone concentration, but it's a change in hormone action. We also have an increase in GLUT4 transport to the cell surface. This is going to be another instance of something that's not a hormone changing the blood, but a change in how our body is handling hormones and handling the systems that are typically controlled by hormones. GLUT4 is the receptor that brings glucose into the cell. We have, after about 30 minutes or more, an increase in cortisol, an increase in aldosterone, an increase in antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Each of these hormones has different functions. A lot of these hormones are going to increase glycogenolysis and glycolysis in the liver and the muscle. This is going to increase the amount of glucose leaving the liver and entering the bloodstream, and also increase the amount of glucose being used by the muscle. The changes in norepinephrine, epinephrine, glucagon, and insulin that I mentioned are all going to be stimulating this. We have an increase in blood pressure and heart rate and stroke volume from the norepinephrine and also from epinephrine. We have an increase in glucose uptake into the exercising muscle from these changes in the sensitivity to insulin, as well as the change in how GLUT4 is being translocated to the cell or the outside of the cells. We have sodium sparing from the aldosterone, and we have water sparing from the antidiuretic hormone, the ADH. Looking at the graph here, you can see cortisone does take some time to really ramp up. Again, starting typically around 30 minutes is where you're going to see that elevate, and it will go down over time after that. The other hormones I mentioned, so we have glucagon in green, the red is the norepinephrine, the goldish yellow color is the epinephrine. They're going to increase over time. Here we see blood glucose going up over time until eventually we lose backup supplies of blood glucose from the liver. That's not a hormone, but it is something that a lot of these hormones are going to be acting on. If we think after exercise, so 30 to 45 minutes after you've stopped exercising, we're still going to have high norepinephrine and epinephrine, cortisol, and we now also have high growth hormone and high testosterone levels. These are all going to help with the recovery from that exercise bout. So the high growth hormone and testosterone are going to specifically be helping with the tissue repair and growth, think muscle repair. There's also an increase in lipolysis, which is fat breakdown, so that increases the usage of fat to decrease the strain on the remaining glucose levels of the body. So all of these hormones up here, except for the testosterone, are going to contribute to that. As you can see here, a lot of these hormones are going to increase 100%, maybe up to 200, maybe up to 250% if you're looking at epinephrine over a long period of time. There is a massive increase in hormones with continuous intense aerobic exercise. The intensity of the exercise is going to be linked to how much hormones released. So greater intensity and greater duration, typically a greater amount of hormone is going to be released, regardless of which of these hormones you're looking at, with the exception of something like cortisol that does come back down over time. This hormone response is going to do a lot of things for us. Just to name a few here, it's going to increase the availability of glucose to fuel the exercise. It's going to increase the cardiac work to better perfuse the body with blood and oxygen and nutrients. And it's going to prevent dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, thinking specifically about the aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone. I'm going to go into how some of these hormones are going to do these things as well as other things in future videos, so make sure to watch those as well. During exercise, the endocrine system and various hormones released by various glands are going to have a massive effect on metabolism. So some of those glands are going to be the anterior pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the adrenal glands, and the pancreas, all of which are going to release hormones that are going to help us regulate metabolism and fuel that exercise session. Depending on the specific session, these are going to help to control how much carbohydrates and how much fat our body's using for metabolism in order to fuel the exercise itself. One of those hormone glands that are really important for controlling exercise metabolism is the anterior pituitary gland. You can see the pituitary gland right there in that red and that skull that's rotating. The anterior pituitary gland is going to be secreting its hormones based on hypothalamic stimulating and inhibitory hormones that are released. With this, exercise is typically going to increase the secretion of all anterior pituitary hormones. So it's going to be mostly stimulation during exercise. One of the hormones that are really important that the anterior pituitary gland is going to release is growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to build tissues and organs. It promotes muscle hypertrophy. It increases fat metabolism and increases blood-free fatty acid. This allows us to have higher amounts of fat utilization to spare glucose because we have a much more limited supply of glucose in our body. Regardless if you're doing aerobic or resistance exercise, the amount of growth hormone being released is going to be proportional to the intensity of that exercise session. Another important gland for controlling the metabolism through the endocrine system is the thyroid gland, which we can see right here as this white mass in the circulating skeleton. The thyroid gland releases triiodothyronine, which is T3, and thyroxine, which is T4, both at rest but also in response to acute exercise. These hormones are going to increase metabolic rates of all tissues of the body. They're going to increase protein synthesis, glucose uptake by the cells, glycolysis, and gluconeogenesis, so increasing the utilization of that glucose that is being uptake, and it's going to increase the amount of new glucose being created from non-glucose original molecules. It's going to increase free fatty acid availability, which is going to help with aerobic metabolism and also help in sparing that glucose because, again, we don't have a ton of glucose in our body. And it's going to increase over time. It's going to increase the number and the size of the mitochondria within our body and within our cells so that we become better with aerobic metabolism. The adrenal medulla, which is the intersection of the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. We can see a cross-section of the adrenal glands here in the medulla is this center part. The outside here is the cortex. but the adrenal medulla is going to be important for increasing norepinephrine and epinephrine release during exercise. Exercise is going to be stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is going to be controlling the adrenal medulla, and it's going to be going directly to it with sympathetic neurons that are going to increase the endocrine release of that adrenal medulla, increasing epinephrine release and norepinephrine release, mostly epinephrine though. So about 80% of what it releases is epinephrine, the other 20% being norepinephrine. These hormones, which are basically the exact same chemicals as the neurotransmitters released by the sympathetic nervous system, are going to act just like those neurotransmitters from the sympathetic neurons, except for because they're going into the bloodstream and floating around a little bit before ending on a cell, a target cell, and a target receptor. They take a little longer to degrade, so they have a longer action. With this, they're going to have all the same actions though, so they're going to increase all the following: heart rate, contractility of the heart, blood pressure, respiration, metabolism, glycogenolysis, so the breakdown of glycogen to release glucose, blood glucose, and free fatty acid availability. So again, glycogenolysis increasing the amount of glucose available. We're also going to be increasing fatty acid availability though, so fats. And we see this aiding in the redistribution of blood flow to the active skeletal muscle. It's going to be doing this by helping to vasoconstrict a lot of the blood vessels around the body in the less active tissues. It is not just the adrenal medulla that's going to have an impact on metabolism during exercise. The adrenal cortex is also going to be involved. The adrenal cortex releases corticohormones. Think cortico meaning the cortex, and steroidal hormones, corticosteroid hormones. The three types are going to be glucocorticoids, which we'll talk about here in a second, mineralocorticoids, and gonatocorticoids. The ones we're going to focus on right now is the glucocorticosteroids, which, as you would guess from the name, is going to be impacting how we handle glucose. In general, though, this has direct effect on metabolism throughout the body. The main glucocorticosteroid that's being released is cortisol. It is 95% of all of the glucocorticosteroid activity within the body. And the effects of cortisol is going to be increased gluconeogenesis, so the creation of glucose from non-glucose substrates, increased free fatty acid availability, increased protein catabolism, decrease glycolysis to spare glucose for the brain. Remember, cortisol gets released typically around 30 minutes in a moderate to intense bout of aerobic exercise. So we're at this point trying to spare glucose a little bit. Cortisol is also going to decrease immune reactions by being an anti-inflammatory agent, which is okay during exercise, not so okay on a sort of constant basis at rest though. All these are acting to try to preserve glucose availability for the brain, and so it's going to increase our uses of fats and increase our uses of proteins, and also increase the availability of glucose in order to do that. The pancreas as a gland is a really important organ. You can see a picture of it right here. It is going to be what controls blood glucose at rest and during exercise. It's the major controller of blood glucose. It's going to do this by releasing two different hormones in different situations. It releases insulin when blood glucose is very high, which is going to bring glucose into the cells and clear blood glucose, and it releases glucagon when blood glucose is low to help boost up glucose levels. So let's go through each of these. Again, insulin is released when blood glucose is high, decreasing the amount of blood glucose by facilitating the transport of glucose into the cells. So it clears the glucose from the bloodstream and pushes it into the cells. It's going to increase synthesis of glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose. Remember, we have too much glucose when we are releasing insulin. It's going to increase protein and fat synthesis as well. It decreases lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat-releasing fatty acids. Remember, we have too much glucose, so we probably want to be using glucose rather than fat at this point in time. And it decreases gluconeogenesis, which is the creation of new glucose. Again, we have too much glucose, we don't want to create more. Glucagon, the opposite hormone released by the pancreas, is going to respond again to low blood glucose. So it's going to increase blood glucose, increasing the release of glucose from the liver into the bloodstream. It's going to increase glycogenolysis, which is that breakdown of the storage form of glucose in the liver, as well as it works on the skeletal muscle. And it's going to increase gluconeogenesis, so the creation of new glucose from non-glucose substrates. So all this is going to increase glucose availability and glucose that gets into the bloodstream. Clearly, blood glucose is really important for the body during exercise. I'm going to have a whole other video where I talk about how we get the blood glucose into the muscle cells, because we actually decrease insulin during exercise. And so come back and make sure that you watch that video as well to help understand that. Glucose is really important for high-intensity exercise. Without glucose availability, we won't be able to perform high-intensity exercise. So how we get blood glucose into the muscle, and also how we replenish that blood glucose to keep supplying glucose to the muscle, is important. So let's talk about that here. So exercise is going to decrease muscle glycogen, because glycogen is that stored form of glucose in the muscle, and we're going to be breaking it down to use that glucose within the muscle. We're also going to be taking in blood glucose in order to continually fuel the muscle with glucose. When we're doing that, we need to start tapping into the liver glycogen. So liver is our other big storage source of glucose. It has a lot of glycogen, that stored form of glucose, in it as well. So we're going to be doing that by activating the pancreas to release glucagon. Glucagon is going to increase liver glucose release alongside some other things that are going to increase this, so epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. But glucagon is probably the most important of these hormones in terms of increasing blood glucose availability. Here in this figure, we can see 3 hours of aerobic cycling exercise at about 65 to 70% of VO2 max. So the time is on the x-axis. We have 3 different y-axes that are color-coded to the 3 different lines. We have a decrease in muscle glycogen over time as we utilize more of that glycogen to break it down into glucose and use it for glycolysis and energy for the exercise. We are going to then have to start utilizing blood glucose and bringing in that blood glucose to continue fueling the exercise. We do see an increase in blood glucose initially before it decreases over time. That increase is going to be fueled by an increase of the glucagon being released by the pancreas. That glucagon is going to stimulate the liver to break down its glycogen, releasing glucose into the bloodstream to allow us to fuel this exercise and have a second source of glucose other than the glucose that's already in the muscle. So this is a good process that helps us to exercise at high intensities for longer periods of time. Let's talk about how we get the blood glucose actually from the blood into the active skeletal muscle during exercise to help fuel that exercise session. Insulin is higher at rest than during exercise, and it's going to be activating GLUT4, which is the glucose transporter type 4. The job of this transporter is to go to the cell surface and essentially facilitate the process of bringing glucose inside the cell. This works in both adipocytes, which is fat, and muscle cells. GLUT4 is the major method of getting blood glucose into the muscle cells, so it's really important for getting that blood glucose in. Notice though, during exercise, the insulin is going to decrease over time. This is the red line here. This is going to help with the boost in blood glucose that occurs, as well as the increase in glucagon that we've already described, which is going to also help with the boost in blood glucose. But by doing this, we aren't going to be able to activate the GLUT4 using insulin anymore. So how does the active muscle cell, continue to bring glucose into the cell when we don't have the insulin there to activate GLUT4? Fortunately, muscle contraction also activates GLUT4. So although we have a decrease in insulin activation of GLUT4 during exercise, we have an increase in the muscle contraction activation of GLUT4 during exercise. The good thing about this is going to stop cells that are less active around the body from bringing in the glucose. They don't have insulin acting on them to bring the glucose into the cell, so they don't bring the glucose into the cell. So that, again, increases how much blood glucose is floating around for the active tissue to then be able to utilize. That active tissue, which can activate its own GLUT4 without insulin by just the muscle contraction, it then gets the preferential treatment and preferential supply of the blood glucose inside that cell in order to continue to fuel that muscle cell to be active during exercise. Exercise is a major stressor on the body. It does not just affect the ability of the body to maintain and blood glucose levels, it also affects other things like electrolyte balances. We're going to be talking about that in another video. During long continuous aerobic exercise, we sweat a lot. That creates a major challenge to our body system's ability to maintain fluid and electrolyte balances. Aldosterone is a hormone released by the adrenal cortex. You can see the cross-section of the adrenal gland being these little glands on top of the kidneys, but the cross-section here shows the adrenal cortex as the outside portion of that adrenal gland. It releases aldosterone, which is the main mineral corticoid released by the adrenal cortex, and its job is to essentially prevent us from losing too much sodium, which is one of our key electrolytes in our body. So the primary driver for the release of aldosterone by the adrenal cortex is a decrease in plasma electrolyte concentration, again, sodium being the key one. So when we have an increase in aldosterone levels in the body, we have an increase in the sodium retention by the kidneys. And this is going to lead to both sodium retention and water retention and potassium secretion by the kidneys. So it does have a lot of actions on electrolyte balances, both sodium, potassium, as well as fluid volumes with water and osmosis of that water. Another factor that's going to be playing here is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which is often just spoken as ROS. So the ROS pathway is the secondary driver for aldosterone released by the adrenal cortex. It's going to be activated by low blood volume or by low blood pressure. So when we have low blood volume or low blood pressure, because low blood pressure is going to be driven in this case by a low blood volume, the kidney is going to release renin. Renin is a hormone that is going to convert angiotensinogen that is released by the liver into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is then converted into angiotensin 2 by the lungs using the angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. You've probably heard of ACE inhibitors that help to lower blood pressure and do different things for the cardiovascular system for people who have cardiovascular disease. All right. Angiotensin 2 is then a stimulator for aldosterone released by the adrenal cortex. So all this gives us, it has lots of actions throughout these different steps of this process, but at the end it is going to increase the aldosterone release, and it's going to also have an direct effect on increasing blood pressure, because angiotensin 2, while also causing aldosterone release, is going to increase blood pressure by causing vasoconstriction around the body. So all this is going to feed back on sodium retention, water retention, potassium secretion, with having vasoconstriction happening at the same time. So this is a major controller of blood pressure as well as electrolyte and fluid balances in the body. If you are doing prolonged aerobic type exercise, specifically higher intensity exercise, and even more so with exercise in a hot environment, you're going to sweat a lot. Over time, you're going to see that your plasma volume drops off. This is because sweat is essentially filtered blood, so it's pulling the plasma out of the blood. And with that, eventually you're going to have an increase in antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and an increase in aldosterone. So let's talk about what exactly that does for us and why those are being released. So the antidiuretic hormone is going to be released by the posterior pituitary gland. It's going to increase during exercise in response to an increase in plasma osmolality, so a concentration essentially of those different molecules other than water within the plasma, and a decrease in the plasma volume. Again, all this is being driven by us sweating. So we're going to be sweating a lot, and we're also going to see a little bit of a shift in the fluid from the vascular space to the interstitial space between cells and the intracellular space within cells. So this is also going to add to the loss of plasma volume. Antidiuretic hormone is going to work directly on the kidneys to prevent us from losing more water. So it's going to promote water retention within the kidneys to maintain the water that's left. Aldosterone is going to do a lot of the same things, but it's specifically trying to work to maintain blood sodium levels. So aldosterone, as already mentioned, is released by the adrenal cortex. Its primary stimulation is low plasma sodium, which leaves the body through sweat, and low blood volume, which also is a result of sweating. We can also stimulate aldosterone by decrease in blood pressure from fluid losses and an increase in potassium concentration. Any of these are going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to work with the kidney to reabsorb sodium that would have otherwise gone out through the urine, and it's also going to work with the sweat glands to prevent as much sodium from leaving our body through our sweat. And with all of this sodium retention, we're going to end up retaining more water, because water follows sodium through osmosis, and we're going to excrete more potassium. Both the antidiuretic hormone and the aldosterone are going to have effects that are going to persist well beyond the exercise, out to 12 to 48 hours after exercise has stopped. And this is going to help increase plasma volumes when you are adjusting to like a high heat environment. We've talked a lot about how the endocrine system during exercise is going to impact the kidneys in order to maintain fluid and electrolyte balances. It also impacts other systems around the body, like the cardiovascular system. I'm going to talk a little bit more of that in another video. During exercise, the endocrine system has a strong influence on the cardiovascular system. The primary hormones that are going to be released, that can be both endocrine or neurotransmitters, depending on how they're released, is epinephrine and norepinephrine. Both are going to increase the work done by the cardiovascular system. When they are released directly on the end organs or from the adrenal medulla, regardless of how the norepinephrine and epinephrine are released, it's going to increase cardiac output through both an increase in heart rate and stroke volume. So we can see over here heart rate increasing as the exercise intensity progresses up to maximal aerobic ability, and stroke volume increasing most of the way to about 50-60% of maximal aerobic ability before it plateaus. Again, both of those are going to be driven primarily by this increase in epinephrine and norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system and the adrenal medulla release of those hormones. We also have an increase in the vascular resistance through vasoconstriction of less active tissues around the body, whether it's non-active skeletal muscle or organs that are just not as active during exercise as the skeletal muscle is. This vasoconstriction around the body is going to redistribute the blood to the active skeletal muscle, which has the ability to ignore these signals through sympatholysis and essentially vasodilate based on the local factors. Another effect on the cardiovascular system that's actually going to originate in the kidneys is the release of the hormone erythropoietin, or EPO. This is released by the kidneys when there is a low amount of blood oxygen being seen by the kidneys. That is going to release the EPO. It's going to go and increase the red blood cell production in the bone marrow, so we end up getting more red blood cells that are able to float around with hemoglobin inside carrying oxygen throughout the body. This is a critical part of the adaptation to altitude exposure, and part of why you hear about people exposing themselves to altitude in order to increase their cardiovascular and aerobic abilities during exercise. When talking about exercise and endocrine responses, a lot of people exercise for the purpose of weight maintenance or weight loss, and we're going to talk about in another video here how the hormones that are released by our body are going to affect your appetite and essentially then affect your ability to do weight loss and weight maintenance. The endocrine system has really powerful effects, and it essentially controls your appetite, so it does affect your ability to do weight maintenance and weight loss plans. The major controller of the appetite in our body is the hypothalamus. You can see the little red spot there in the middle of that circulating skull. That is the hypothalamus. The satiety center is in the ventrolateral nucleus of the hypothalamus, and the hunger center is in the lateral hypothalamus. Both of these are going to control essentially how much we feel the need to eat. The short-term regulation of hunger and satiety is largely going to be driven by blood concentration of nutrients, think amino acids, blood glucose, lipids, cholesterol, that kind of thing. And this is also going to have feedback by hormones released by the gastrointestinal tract and adipocytes, which are fat cells. Those tissues are going to release hormones that are going to impact our satiety and hunger centers. There are various hormones being released by the gastrointestinal tract that are going to feed back on that hypothalamus, controlling the appetite and satiety centers, or at least influencing them. These hormones tend to have a short-term effect on appetite. One of those hormones is cholecystokinin, or CCK. It's going to increase when the stomach is full, and it's going to be released by the small intestine. This suppresses the appetite. So all these ones in red are going to suppress the appetite. We also release glucagon-like peptide 1, or GPL1, which is released by the small and large intestine. We release peptide YY, or PYY, released by the small and large intestine as well, and we release insulin from the pancreas. All of these are going to suppress your appetite. We also release ghrelin, which is going to increase our appetite. So it's the only one listed here that's going to increase appetite. Ghrelin is going to be released by the stomach and the pancreas when the stomach is empty. These are all short-term acting hormones. We do have a feedback method that is a little more long-term in its action, and that is our leptin release, so the hormone leptin. It is released by body fat in proportion to how much body fat our bodies have. So the more body fat you have, the more leptin release you're going to have, and leptin is an appetite suppressant. Ghrelin and leptin are often sort of opposing molecules that are going to oppose each other in controlling our appetite. Remember, ghrelin increases it and leptin suppresses it. If you have leptin inhibition, where you can see an example here in this mouse model, this is the normal mouse. This is a mouse that has leptin inhibition, and it is much, much larger. It promotes eating because it is going to, when you have leptin, it's going to suppress appetite. So when you don't have leptin, it's not going to suppress the appetite, and you're going to feel hungry and you're going to eat a lot more. Changes in leptin happen very slowly because changes in body fat happen very slowly, and this is what makes it really good for controlling appetite on a long-term basis. Endocrine hormones don't just control our ability to gain or lose body fat, it also controls our ability to gain or lose muscle mass. So I'm going to be talking about our endocrine control of muscle mass in a separate video. Our endocrine system has really powerful impacts on our ability to control muscle growth or atrophy, so we're going to be talking about that in this video. Fiber hypertrophy, which is the growth of the muscle fibers, so the individual cells going from small to large, that is going to be facilitated largely by testosterone. Testosterone is the most important anabolic hormone we have. It works synergistically with growth hormone, so the two together are going to promote more protein synthesis and more hypertrophy than either one by themselves. And they are going to be increased following resistance exercise in both men and women, although women do see less of it, so less of an increase, as well as less at baseline than men, and so do prepubescent boys. Some other hormones that are important here are growth hormone, as I already mentioned, insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF, which is IGF-1, insulin, and thyroid hormones. All of these are going to help promote muscle growth. These are not the full story, though, I should say. So the endocrine system is a major influencer on skeletal muscle growth, but there are subcellular processes involving things like mTOR that also affect the muscle growth, so they cannot be ignored, but this is focused on the endocrine system, so we're not going to talk about that here today. Reversing things here and talking about fiber atrophy, so the decrease in muscle fiber size, so going from large muscle fibers to small muscle fibers, that is going to be driven by cortisol primarily. Cortisol is a catabolic hormone. It's going to cause the breakdown of muscle proteins, and it's going to work in opposition to the testosterone. Interesting, it's going to be that balance of testosterone to cortisol. It's going to determine if you have atrophy or if you have hypertrophy. So if you have more testosterone binding than cortisol binding, it's going to essentially block the cortisone from binding in the DNA in the areas where it's going to promote atrophy. And so you're going to end up with hypertrophy. And if it's the opposite, if you have more cortisol binding than testosterone, you're going to get atrophy. The cortisol is important, though, to the process of remodeling the skeletal muscle, which is part of hypertrophy as well as atrophy, because it's going to help in the removal of the damaged proteins in the muscle following exercise. So both cortisol and testosterone are important to the process. You just want more testosterone than cortisol in order to boost muscle growth rather than having atrophy. The endocrine system is really powerful for its influence on the ability to grow muscle, but it is not the only only factor affecting muscle growth. mTOR works with testosterone in order to increase muscle protein synthesis, but it also has independent factors, so independent of testosterone, that are going to affect mTOR's activity, and mTOR is ultimately what is going to control muscle growth.